The Coalition War College on Station Meridian had been training fleet officers for 210 years. Its graduation rate was 58%, the lowest of any institution in the Outer Coalition, and deliberately so. The college did not exist to teach competence. It existed to find the officers who already had it and remove everyone else from the pipeline before they reached a real command. Alumni of Meridian held command positions across 14 active fleets. A posting to Meridian was not treated as an achievement. It was treated as a filter, and everyone inside it knew which side of the filter they were hoping to land on. In 210 years, the college had graduated 43 humans. The number was small enough that fleet records kept it as a single line item rather than a category. The current tactics cohort had won. The species itself was still a rounding error in Coalition military history. A late addition to a war that had already been fought, in various forms, for 600 years before humanity had a functioning starship capable of reaching the front. The Coalition's other species had absorbed this history gradually, through campaigns passed down across generations, through doctrine that had been refined and re-refined since before any human alive had been born. Humans had arrived to the war roughly 2 decades ago, uninvited by any formal process, unprepared by any Coalition metric, and had been treated ever since the way a conversation treats someone who walks in during the middle of it, politely enough, but with the quiet assumption that they were still catching up to context everyone else already had. Cadet Elias Voss did not correct this impression. He simply did not confirm it either, and in a room full of people accustomed to being either corrected or confirmed, his silence on the matter had, over 2 terms, become its own kind of statement that nobody had yet learned to read. Elias had arrived at Meridian with a file that his admissions officer had read 3 times, because the first reading produced a service record that seemed structurally incompatible with a 24-year-old applicant. The second reading confirmed that the dates were not a clerical error. The third reading was less about verification and more about the officer needing a moment to sit with what she had just approved, because approving it meant admitting a cadet whose actual command experience already outranked most of the instructors who would be teaching him theory. The file listed 11 months of continuous command at a frontier defense post called Calder Reach, a garrison of 40 personnel holding a supply corridor that 3 separate Coalition strategic assessments had already written off as unrecoverable before the siege even reached its 2nd month. It listed a siege that outside observers had stopped actively tracking around month 4, on the working assumption that the outcome was no longer meaningfully in question. It listed a relief force dispatched not to rescue a garrison, but to relieve one, a distinction the relief commander's own log drew explicitly, because by the time they arrived, rescue was no longer the operative word for what they found. Elias had not mentioned any of this to anyone. He had arrived at the college 2 weeks before term began, found his quarters, unpacked a single case of belongings, and started reading the assigned material a full cycle before anyone else in his cohort had opened the first chapter. The only object he unpacked that his roommate noticed was a plain reclamation blade, service-worn along one edge, the kind issued to frontier garrisons for equipment salvage rather than combat. He set it on a shelf, did not display it, and did not mention it again. His roommate, a fair-eyed cadet named Os Turin, tried twice in the first month to draw out some version of a war story, the way cadets do when they are curious about someone and don't yet know how to ask directly. Both times, Elias answered with logistics, supply rotations, equipment failure rates, the specific difficulty of keeping 40 people fed on a corridor that got resupplied once every 6 weeks if the weather cooperated. Never once did he mention the part where people had been trying to kill them the entire time. Os eventually stopped asking, not because he lost interest, but because he noticed that Elias wasn't avoiding the subject out of modesty. He genuinely seemed to consider the logistics the more interesting half of the story. By the end of the first term, 3 separate instructors had filed early evaluations on Cadet Voss, using 3 different words that all meant the same thing. Unremarkable, competent, punctual, quiet, unremarkable. It was, by every visible measure available to the college, an accurate description of the cadet everyone believed they were looking at. The challenge came during a second-term seminar on frontier engagement doctrine, in the kind of room where 40 cadets sit in tiered rows and one instructor sits at the head of a long table, watching more than teaching. In a discussion format the college used specifically to let cadets test theory against each other before they were allowed to test it against anything real. Cadet Kessa Prine, a Doroth, third year, ranked first in the tactics cohort, the kind of cadet whose name instructors used as the benchmark against which other cadets were measured, introduced the human question the way that certain cadets introduce questions, which is to say, with the timing and tone of someone who has prepared it well in advance, and has simply been waiting for the discussion to walk close enough to the trap for it to look like it arrived there naturally. "I've been curious about something," Kessa said, in the tone of someone raising a point of genuine academic interest rather than a challenge. "Given how recently humanity entered the war relative to the rest of the coalition, what does an actual human combat record look like compared to the rest of us? Not training exercises, not simulations, confirmed engagements." Several cadets smiled. It was the category of smile that happens in rooms where a hierarchy is being quietly enforced, and everyone present already knows which side of it they are standing on. It was not a cruel smile. Kessa was not being cruel, and neither were the cadets smiling along. It was the smile of people who believed, with total sincerity, that they already knew the shape of the answer and were simply waiting politely for the room to arrive at a conclusion that felt, to them, already settled before the question had finished being asked. Instructor Davin Kale, at the head of the table, said nothing. He had pulled Elias' engagement logs from fleet records in the second week of term, out of simple institutional curiosity about a file that had crossed his desk during admissions review, and had cross-referenced them against 3 independent verification sources before he allowed himself to fully believe what they said. He had been waiting, since then, for a discussion topic that would let the file speak for itself rather than have him present it as a lecture nobody had asked for. This, he decided, watching Kessa's prepared timing land exactly where Kessa had planned it to land, was close enough. "That's a reasonable question," Elias said, in the tone of someone who genuinely found it reasonable. He was not being modest, and he was not being ironic. He appeared, as he usually did, to be considering the question on its own terms, turning it over the way he turned over most questions before answering them. "Do you want the confirmed defensive actions, or the total including support engagements?" Kessa's smile held, amused by the specificity of the offer. "Whichever number is more impressive." "They're the same number," Elias said. 211. The silence that followed did not arrive all at once. It moved through the room the way a wave moves through still water, the cadets nearest Elias first, then outward, row by row, until it reached the back wall and Kessa's smile, which stopped the way a wave stops when it meets something it did not expect to still be standing. 211. Kessa repeated, and it was not a challenge this time. It was a cadet checking that they had heard the number correctly, because the alternative, that they had heard it correctly the first time, required recalculating several assumptions at once, and recalculating in front of 40 other cadets was not a comfortable place to do it. "Frontier reclamation counts differently than fleet doctrine does," Elias said, entirely without inflection, the way he explained most logistics. "We count individual actions, not campaigns. Different unit of measurement. If you want it converted to a fleet standard campaign equivalent, it's closer to 6. Nobody in the room at that moment asked him to convert it down. Nobody wanted the number smaller. Os Turin, 3 seats to Elias' left, said nothing at all, but his expression was the specific stillness of someone quietly reconsidering 11 months of conversations about supply rotations and realizing, all at once, what those conversations had actually been describing. Instructor Kale let the silence run for exactly as long as silence needed to run, long enough for the room to sit inside it, not so long that it curdled into discomfort, and then opened a secondary display at the head of the table. "Since I have the room's attention," he said, in the precise neutrality of a good instructor who has been waiting 8 weeks to say exactly this sentence, "let's look at some of it." The footage was not dramatic in the way that academy training simulations were dramatic. It was documentary, helmet cam and drone relay footage from a defense post most of the room had never heard of, time-stamped across 11 months, unpolished in the specific way real recordings are unpolished when nobody involved expected them to be reviewed by 40 strangers later. The first case study was a supply corridor breach in month 2, 40 defenders against a raiding force nearly 4 times their number, resolved not through firepower, but through a redistribution of the garrison's few heavy weapons across 3 choke points instead of 1. A decision made in under 6 minutes with no communication reaching any higher command, because no higher command was reachable at the time. The footage showed the redistribution order given once, without repetition, and executed without a single follow-up question from the garrison. The second was a coordinated night assault in month 5, defeated using a rotating fallback tactic, the seminar's own textbook, 3 chapters ahead of where the cohort currently stood, described as theoretical best practice for undermanned frontier positions. Elias had apparently written the practical version of the tactic the textbook would later describe, roughly a year before the textbook existed to describe it. The third and fourth case studies, shown in quicker succession, covered a supply failure in month 7 that Elias garrison solved by salvaging parts from 3 disabled perimeter drones. The same category of reclamation blade now sitting on a shelf in a dormitory 2 decks above the seminar room, and a diplomatic near-miss in month 8 involving a neutral trade convoy that Elias' log described, with characteristic understatement, as resolved before it became a problem, with no further elaboration offered anywhere in the record. By the 5th case study, Kessa was not smiling. By the 8th, Kessa was watching with the expression of someone doing a calculation that was going to take longer than the class period to finish, the specific stillness of a cadet recalculating not just one wrong answer, but the framework the answer had been built inside of. The 9th case study showed the relief force's arrival in month 11, and the detail instructor Kale paused on longest was not the arrival itself, but the state of the garrison when it arrived. 40 personnel, all of them still alive, still standing post, still running the same duty rotation they had run since month 1. The relief commander's own log, displayed on screen without comment from Kale, described the handover not as a rescue, but as the shortest briefing of my career because there was nothing left that needed explaining to me. The room was completely silent through all 9. Halfway through the 9th case study, instructor Kale paused the footage on a single frame. The garrison's perimeter at the moment, the relief force's shuttle first appeared on their scanners. He let it sit there long enough for the cohort to notice what he wanted them to notice. Nobody in the frame had moved toward the shuttle. Every visible defender was still facing outward, still watching the perimeter they had been watching for 11 months, because the shuttle on the scanner was not yet confirmed friendly, and confirming it was not Elias' job. It was the duty rotation's job, running exactly as scheduled, on exactly the hour it had run every day since month 1. "This is the part of the file that took me longest to believe," Kale said, to the room rather than to Elias. "Not the numbers, the fact that nothing changed when rescue arrived. The rotation didn't loosen. Nobody broke formation to watch the shuttle land. I've read command logs from officers twice this cadet's age who couldn't have held that discipline for 11 days, let alone 11 months. Nobody in the room offered a counterpoint. Even Kessa, watching the frozen frame with the same recalculating stillness as before, did not attempt one. Kessa did not say anything until the lights came back up, and did not say anything then either for a long moment. When the seminar ended and cadets began filing out, Kessa stopped at the door, not to leave. But the way someone stops when there is one sentence left that needs saying before a conversation can actually close. The frontier count and the campaign equivalent count are different by about 205, Kessa said. It was not an apology. It was a cadet, out loud, confirming that a framework had been updated and that the update had been formally logged, the way a good tactician logs any correction to a working model. Elias did not respond to that in any way that resembled satisfaction. He was already gathering his materials, a data slate, a stylus, and the reclamation blade, which he had brought that day for an unrelated afternoon practical, and now returned to his bag without ceremony, the same unhurried way he had unpacked it 2 terms earlier. There was no lingering look at the room, no acknowledgement of what had just happened inside it. The work of the day was not yet finished, and he moved toward finishing it. Kessa left without another word. Not humiliated. The room did not read it that way, and neither did Instructor Kale, who watched the door close and made a private note that Kessa's tactical instincts had, if anything, just been sharpened rather than damaged by the correction. A cadet who updates a framework this quickly, Kale thought, had not lost anything in the process. They had simply been shown, cleanly and without cruelty, where the map ended and the territory began, and a cadet ranked first in the cohort was, of everyone in that room, the one most likely to remember the lesson correctly. Elias stayed behind after the room emptied to return a borrowed data reader, which put him alone at the table with instructor Kale for the length of time it took to hand it across. "You could have led with the number," Kale said. "Save the room 8 case studies and yourself an audience." "The number doesn't mean anything without the case studies," Elias said. "Anyone can survive on paper if the paper is generous enough. I wanted them to see the corridor, not the total." Kale studied him for a moment, not with surprise, because he had stopped being surprised by Elias somewhere around the third file review back in the second week. But with the specific attentiveness of someone confirming a suspicion he had carried into the room and was now carrying back out of it fully settled. "Since the second week of term," Kale said. "I've been waiting for a topic that would let that file speak instead of me summarizing it in a lecture nobody would have believed anyway." "You could have just told them," Elias said. "They wouldn't have believed a summary," Kale said. "They believed the footage." Elias picked up his bag, the reclamation blade settled where it had started, and turned toward the door. "Same time next week," he said. "Same time," Kale said. After the door closed, Kale sat alone with the display still open in front of him, and did not immediately close it. He thought, not for the first time that term, about the 43 humans who had graduated from Meridian in 210 years, and about how few of their files had ever made it into a classroom the way this one just had. Most of them, he suspected, had simply done the work and let the record sit unread in a drawer somewhere, the way Elias clearly would have preferred his to sit if a discussion topic hadn't walked close enough to force the issue. 3 weeks later, the tactics cohort ran its first joint field exercise of the term, a simulated corridor defense. 40 cadets split into defending and attacking teams, the kind of exercise the college used every year and had used in some form for most of its 210. The team assignments were drawn at random, the way they always were, and the draw put Kessa and Elias on the same defending team, holding the same 3 choke points the textbook described, and the footage had already shown working once, somewhere real. Kessa did not ask Elias to take command. Nobody suggested it, and no rule required it. But when the exercise clock started and the simulated raiding force began its approach, Kessa looked once toward Elias, waited for the smallest nod, and redirected the team's heavy weapons across the 3 choke points without further discussion. The same redistribution from Case Study 1, executed now by someone who had watched it happen and decided, quietly, that watching it once had been enough to learn it. The exercise ended in the defending team's favor, faster, and with fewer simulated losses than any other defending team that day. Nobody mentioned the number 211. Nobody needed to. Elias gathered his equipment afterward the same unhurried way he gathered it every time. And this time it was Kessa who fell into step beside him on the walk back to the barracks corridor, saying nothing in particular, simply walking the same direction for a while because there was no longer any reason not to. Instructor Kale watched the exercise results come through his terminal that evening and did not write a new note. The old one still stood, 3 words against a name that had needed exactly 3 words since the day he wrote them, and nothing in the weeks since had given him any reason to add a 4th. Already commanding it.